On this week's episode of Representation Without Taxation, we are going to talk about return to play with Major League Soccer. And I have today here with me, Logan. And I'm just so glad you're here, Logan. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in soccer and just what your background in soccer is.
Yeah, thanks, Jill, for having me. I'm recently graduated from Denison University, and growing up, I've played soccer since I was about 3 years old, played it up through my senior year at Denison. In college, I interned with the Major League Soccer team last summer, the Columbus Crew, and ever since then, I've really been interested in all the teams in Major League Soccer and how they interact with each other. And I've really found that since all the play stopped, how play is going to return is going to be very interesting for how everything's going to go.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Major League Soccer has returned to play, okay? And what are the testing procedures for COVID in Major League Soccer? Because I think this is very interesting, and it's something I didn't realize until I had talked to you more.
Yeah, so for Major League Soccer, they're returning to play with their MLS is Back tournament. And it's a hub city tournament, kind of similar to what the NHL and NBA are doing as well, where all the teams are going to one city and playing out their games there. So the MLS, they're going to Orlando. The tournament starts July 8th. I'm not sure when this comes out. But so they're playing in Orlando July 8th through about mid-August, and then after that they should return to their home markets to continue the rest of the regular season. What's interesting about it is, so when each team goes to Orlando, before they can even leave their home markets to go into their hotel in Orlando, they have to test. Each player has been periodically tested for the coronavirus throughout their time that they've been training at home, and before they can get on their chartered flight to even leave for Orlando, they have to test negative twice within 24 hours of leaving for Orlando. Okay. Once they fly to Orlando, once they've touched down, they immediately get tested again. And they have to self-isolate until that test comes back negative, and then they're free to practice then.
So that means 3 tests happen before they even are saying, hey, you can go out and play. Yes. Okay.
Yes. So once that happens, for the next 2 weeks after they touch down, and if your team have already arrived in Orlando, once that they've touched down, then the players and all the staff that are there get tested every other day for 2 weeks straight. And anytime if a positive test comes, that player goes into isolation until they're cleared by medical staff to come back to play. And then after those 2 weeks are up, where tests are every other day, the teams then are tested periodically throughout. So I believe at least before every game, which happen about every 6 days to once a week. So probably about once or twice a week, players are going to get tested.
Okay, so right now, though, haven't there been some positive tests, and what has been going on with that as far as these tournaments?
Yeah, so the tournament's in Orlando, which has been growing with cases already. And so one of the first teams to arrive was FC Dallas. And when they touched down and had their tests in Orlando, 2 of the players tested positive. So those players immediately went off into isolation, and Dallas was able to continue with training. But during their every other day testings, 4 more players on their team have now tested positive for corona. So the team has now halted training for yesterday and today, which is July 1st, and they're reevaluating the situation on a day-to-day basis based on continually testing the current players that are available and just checking up on the status of the 6 players that did test positive.
Okay, so 6 players tested positive, but we also talked about, don't they test them twice before they even determine that they tested positive. They have to test positive twice. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So I guess one thing that Major League Soccer is trying to mitigate are the number of false positives. So those are sometimes tests are faulty, like everything. Nothing's perfect. That their concern is that sometimes someone's going to test positive once and they're actually not going to, it's going to be a false positive. So what Major League Soccer has stated is that, like, for them to officially announce that someone is positive for the coronavirus or has coronavirus, they have to test positive twice in a row while taking these swabs. So I think mainly in these cases, what they've announced is these players probably have only tested positive once in a row, maybe twice, but okay, I think that right now they're trying to be extra cautious, but for them to like have the coronavirus in the eyes of the MLS, they have to test positive twice in a row.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So now let's say a player does test positive. So, and I'm trying to compare this to the NFL. So if the NFL, if somebody's injured, they go on a certain status and a certain pay status. Mm-hmm. In Major League Soccer, what's that like? Like if they're testing positive, do they get paid or do they not get paid? How's this going to work?
Well, so leading up to the tournament, the Major League Soccer and the Major League Soccer Players Association negotiated a new CBA, literally just weeks before the tournament was supposed to start. And in the CBA, they don't say anything about the payment of the players when it comes to if they catch the coronavirus, where some players, I guess for some players, if they decided not to go to the tournament, whether it was for health reasons or family reasons or whatever, they're not getting paid. So I don't know if if the reason why they can't come would be, they haven't specifically said is what they would pay the players if they test positive for it and they're unable to play. One interesting thing that the MLS does have in their CBA is that if a player does get injured on the job, so playing in a game or at practice or playing for their national team, the player's contract and what money they're supposed to earn doesn't go away. So they still earn their salary even if they do get injured.
Okay, so is coronavirus though not equaling an injury in MLS, in Major League Soccer?
They haven't explicitly said what it is.
Oh. Because let's say they do get the virus from another player while they're practicing. Is that an injury? It's just a sickness? I mean, this is the issue that all the major professional sports are going to have, by the way.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting situation because these players that are in Orlando, they're in a quote unquote bubble. So the only way that they're going to get the disease is through contact with players, coaches, other staff members that are in this bubble. And it's not a perfect bubble. Like the hotel staff that like bring them their room, that do their room service, they're not required to like self-isolate and they can come and go from their homes and make those choices. But these players are under contract to be at this hotel and go through this. So I would assume that if they're there, they should be compensated, even if they do test positive and are unable to play.
Yeah, interesting. So what other issues do you see with returning to play? And I know you briefly talked about a tournament in Utah that was going on. Tell me a little bit about what you know about that.
Yeah, so the NWSL, which is the National Women's Soccer League, started their tournament in Salt Lake City over the weekend. And so the NWSL, they're much smaller than the MLS. They're only in like their first few years of existence, but they're growing rapidly. And so their tournament kicked off this weekend in Utah. There's 8 teams and there's 9 teams in the league, but one of the teams, the Orlando Pride, had 9 players on its team test positive for the coronavirus.
Ooh.
And a lot of in that situation was some of the players had gone out to a bar in Orlando unknowingly, got the disease and spread it amongst players on the team. And suddenly, when you have 9 players off of a roster, suddenly you just don't have enough people to field like a squad with rotation in a tournament where you haven't been playing full games very much. So there's going to be injuries. So they backed out of the tournament completely. And that's, I guess, a level of concern for Major League Soccer for their return to play in Orlando is they have procedures. So if a player tests positive, the tournament can still continue. But if, as we've seen with FC Dallas, and Dallas has some time, but if it continues to spread throughout their team, if two or three more players on their team test positive and they're not able to clear before the start of the tournament on July 8th, suddenly are they able to field a team for the tournament safely?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, so were these players asymptomatic, do you know, or?
One of the players that posted that she had tested positive, she wasn't one of the players that went out to the bars. She said that she was asymptomatic. So that's, as far as I know, no one has had like any symptoms, but from what I've been reading, that doesn't mean that it's still not affecting you.
Gosh, so it's just so interesting. So what other issues, I know you talked about a lot of soccer players play on 2 different teams, and how is that impacting all the players in, I guess, women's and men's soccer?
Yeah, so I guess they're 2 very different stories. So for soccer, it's interesting because players have their club team, which is like their Major League Soccer team or their National Women's Soccer League team. And then they're also have the opportunity, if they're in the best 20 to 30 players from their country, to represent their national team. And throughout the year, the national teams play various games, whether it's a friendly or in different tournaments. And so in the terms of US, the men's national team was supposed to have a set of matches in June that got canceled because of the coronavirus break, and they not wanting their players to travel outside the country, and just the dangers of playing sports at that point. So their games had been canceled. As for the women were supposed to be competing in the Tokyo Olympics this summer. And with the Olympics being canceled or pushed back to 2021, they were unable to compete. So with that, what happens to these players with the pay that they were supposed to receive for these games? Well, the men's national team players often get paid by their club's salary and then get a bonus for every national team game that they play for. So if a player doesn't get called up for one national team camp, they're not going to get paid for those games. Whereas with the women's national team, they get a majority of their money from the national team and not their NWSL club. So these women get their salaries from the women's national team. So they are getting paid still for the games that would have been this summer in Tokyo. They're not getting the bonuses, but they're still getting their salary that they would for the national team because that's how their CBAs were structured differently.
Oh, interesting. So is there anything else about returning to play that you see to be an issue with Major League Soccer? And how do you think this applies to all the other sports? Like what can we be learning from what's going on with Major League Soccer?
Yeah, I think that Major League Soccer is kind of benefited because the thing is there's only one NFL. NFL is kind of like the leading league for football. Like there's a bunch of other leagues within like the United States and Canada that haven't been playing either. But the the MLS and US soccer have been able to benefit from a bunch of European leagues. So for example, the German Bundesliga returned to play in mid-May. So they've had that chance to kind of learn the protocols through testing and how to broadcast the games to like maximize like the entertainment value. And other leagues, such as like in Spain's back, England's back, France canceled their league, but Italy's back. So all these leagues have returned to play. So Major League Soccer's been able to benefit by watching all these other leagues and seeing what works for them and they can now transfer it into their league. And while other leagues, sports leagues in the United States, they might not have comparable leagues in other countries to be able to see what they're doing. So that's one thing that Major League Soccer has an advantage over. And maybe what happens when the NFL comes back, they can see, oh, this is what worked for Major League Soccer, because Major League Soccer, if you think of sports like on a spectrum, NFL and like English Premier League are very different, but somewhere in the middle is Major League Soccer because it has that American aspect and it also has the sporting side of soccer. So the NFL can see what works for Major League Soccer in their American audience, so that they can adapt to when they return to play.
And what about, there's a lot of international travel with Major League Soccer. So how are they handling that? Do you know?
Yeah, so Major League Soccer, there's only 3 teams in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that those teams got clearance to go to Orlando, and I think that it's helpful that everything's in one hub location because of that. So they don't have to worry about people constantly traveling and spreading the virus. They're all in one concentrated area. Hopefully when this MLS is back tournament ends in mid-August and they return to their home markets, there'll be more knowledge about what to do with international travel. But like I said, it's not like they're traveling to Europe or South America. The 3 teams in Canada are Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. So it's not like they're traveling very far outside of internationally.
Okay. And so what happens like for the World Cup, let's say? What do you project? Because right now people can't travel to Europe from the US anyway, right?
Yeah. Luckily, the next World Cup isn't supposed to be until the winter of 2022. So December 2022.
Okay.
So there's still time for things to help clear out and understand like what the new normal will be in terms of international sports. And I think they'll benefit from whatever happens with the Olympics next summer, if they happen, or whatever changes occur to them. I think the biggest question is what happens with World Cup qualifying, because like other sports, not every team can compete in the World Cup. Only the 32 best teams in the world can go. So, and the United States was supposed to begin World Cup qualifying in September, and they were supposed to be halfway done with it by the end of 2020. So now that can't happen, the federation, the CONCACAF, which includes all the North and Central American teams, the teams in the Caribbean, they have to readjust how their plan to go through World Cup qualifying to pick what 3 teams are going to represent this part of the world in the World Cup.
Interesting. Okay, so it's going to impact the World Cup qualifiers for sure.
Yes, there's still questions. They still have not decided about how it's going to look. It could make the U.S.'s path to the World Cup, which they failed to qualify for in 2018. It could make it easier for them because they won't have to face Mexico, possibly. It could also make it more difficult having different competition and just not having time to prepare for it, because there are some people who think that maybe the first time the men's national team is able to come back together is going to be during World Cup qualifying, which are very high stakes matches. And they've had a coach for a little over a year, a new coach, and it's a very young roster. And so they're just looking for opportunities to bring them together, and they might not have that.
Interesting. So let me ask you something, Logan. I know you're like starting up a new kind of concept. Why don't you share with my audience what it is you're doing and how they can get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I recently started a podcast. It's called the Number 10 Podcast. And for those people who aren't familiar with soccer, there's some historical idea that the number 10 on the soccer field, which is typically like the attacking center mid, are like the key playmakers, like the very cerebral, creative players on the field. And so my idea as the number 10 is I want to talk about the most important, most creative moments from Major League Soccer and soccer in the United States. So I've started this podcast. It's called the Number 10 Podcast. You can find it on Spotify, iTunes, anywhere you can get your podcast. You can also reach me on Twitter at Logan Agin. It's LOGANAGIN.
Great. Okay. So this has been a really interesting conversation. And I really thank you for filling me in on the whole soccer world, because I don't know as much about it. And I was curious. I really feel like in the other sports around the world, and particularly in the US, we need to follow what Major League Soccer is doing, because they're the first ones to come back. Obviously, the NBA too is coming back and is in the same place as Major League Soccer. So we really need to pay attention to that and watch out. And hey, thank you so much, Logan. And everybody, please go to Logan's podcast if you're curious about soccer. And thanks so much for being on my show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.